The snowflakes danced against Marcus Thompson's windshield as he drove through the empty streets of Cedar Falls that December night, his old pickup truck's heater barely keeping the cold at bay. What he saw next would change everything he thought he knew about second chances and the price of walking away from a life that isn't yours. A woman in a dirty white wedding dress stood by the roadside, holding her high heels in one hand while snow gathered on her bare shoulders. His headlights caught the torn hem of her gown, mascara smeared beneath her eyes, but there was something in her gaze that struck him most, a determination that showed no trace of fear despite her circumstances. Marcus pulled over and rolled down his window, asking the question that would unravel secrets worth millions of dollars. "You need a ride, miss?" The woman looked at him through the glass, hesitating for just a moment before opening the door with trembling fingers. "Please. Just away from here, please," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air as she slipped into the passenger seat. Marcus nodded, not knowing that this moment would force him to confront everything he'd given up and everything he was afraid to want again. Cedar Falls, Iowa was the kind of town where 3,000 people knew each other's business before breakfast, where Main Street held Miller's Diner, Henderson's Hardware, and the Yellow Brick Library that had stood since 1923. The cornfields stretched endlessly beyond the town limits, and in winter, the landscape turned into a white canvas that reminded Marcus of canvases he used to paint on. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked from his pickup to the diner, the woman in the wedding dress beside him looking fragile against the harsh Iowa wind. Helen Miller, the diner owner with silver hair and knowing eyes, took one look at the situation and ushered them inside without a single question. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and the warmth hit Marcus's face like a gentle embrace. Marcus Thompson had inherited more than just Henderson's garage when his father passed 3 years ago. He'd inherited the weight of responsibility that came with being a single father in a small town. At 35, his hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and the calluses of honest work, but his eyes held the distant look of someone who had once dreamed of different things. His flannel shirt was faded from countless washings, his jeans worn thin at the knees, and his leather boots had seen more miles than most people's cars. Anna had been gone for 2 years now, taken by a drunk driver on a rainy Thursday evening, leaving behind 8-year-old Emma and a man who had forgotten how to hope for anything beyond getting through each day. The house felt too quiet without Anna's laughter, too empty without her presence filling the spaces between conversations. Emma Thompson was 8 years old, with paint-stained fingers and a smile that could melt the coldest Iowa winter. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she drew pictures of families with stick figures that always included 3 people, even though their family had been reduced to 2. Her backpack was covered in patches from places she'd never been, gifts from her father's customers who traveled through Cedar Falls on their way to somewhere more important. She spent her afternoons at the garage doing homework on the workbench while Marcus fixed transmissions and replaced brake pads, her crayon drawings scattered between tool catalogs and repair manuals. The other kids at school talked about their mothers, and Emma would quietly fold her hands and stare out the window at the clouds that looked like people she couldn't quite remember. The mystery woman introduced herself simply as Sarah, and Helen offered her the small room above the diner without asking for explanations or identification. Marcus found himself stopping by Miller's Diner every morning before opening the garage, ordering his usual black coffee and finding reasons to linger at the counter. Sarah moved through the diner with an odd grace, as if she was used to more elegant surroundings, but was determined to adapt to these simpler circumstances. She remembered how each customer liked their coffee, never wrote down orders, and had a way of listening that made people feel heard in a town where everyone thought they knew everything about everyone else. There was something about the way she held a pencil when she took orders, the way her eyes followed the morning light as it moved across the diner's windows, that suggested she saw the world differently than most people in Cedar Falls. The connection between Marcus and Sarah grew slowly, like ice melting in spring, through small gestures and shared silences. She would refill his coffee before he asked, and he would leave a larger tip than necessary, their only conversation consisting of polite nods and careful smiles. When Emma wandered into the diner after school, Sarah would crouch down to her level and admire her drawings with the kind of attention that made the little girl's face light up with joy. Marcus watched these interactions from his booth, seeing his daughter respond to feminine attention she'd been missing for 2 years, and felt something shift in his chest that he wasn't ready to name. Sarah had a way of encouraging Emma's artistic efforts that suggested she understood something about creativity that most people in Cedar Falls didn't value or recognize. One afternoon, Marcus found himself working on Sarah's borrowed Honda Civic in the garage bay, the engine making a knocking sound that suggested bigger problems than most people could afford to fix. Sarah stood nearby, asking questions about the engine that showed she was genuinely interested in learning, not just making conversation. Her hands were clean and soft, unlike the women Marcus was used to dating, but she wasn't afraid to get close to the greasy machinery or to hand him tools when he needed them. Emma sat on an overturned crate, drawing a picture of the three of them standing next to the car, and Marcus felt a dangerous warmth spreading through his chest as he watched his daughter include Sarah in her imaginary family. The afternoon light filtered through the garage windows, casting long shadows that made the scene feel like something worth preserving, something worth remembering. The first crack in Sarah's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Saturday morning when Emma asked her about her family over pancakes at the diner. Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee cup, and she looked out the window at the snow-covered cornfields before answering with a voice that carried the weight of untold stories. "Sometimes people need to find their own path, sweetheart," she said, reaching across the table to touch Emma's hand with gentle fingers. Marcus watched the exchange, noting how Sarah's eyes seemed to hold secrets that went far beyond a simple runaway bride story, how her posture suggested she was used to being watched and judged. Emma accepted the answer with the easy trust of childhood, but Marcus filed away the moment, adding it to the growing list of things about Sarah that didn't quite add up to the simple story she'd presented. The yellow canvas handkerchief that Sarah always carried became a source of quiet fascination for Marcus, who noticed how she touched it whenever she seemed nervous or lost in thought. The fabric was worn, soft from handling, with faded embroidery around the edges that suggested it had been important to someone for a long time. When Emma spilled chocolate milk on her shirt, Sarah offered the handkerchief without hesitation, and Marcus saw tears gather in her eyes as she watched his daughter carefully dab at the stain. There was something about the way Sarah held onto that small piece of fabric that suggested it connected her to a life she'd left behind, a life that might be more complicated than anyone in Cedar Falls could imagine. Marcus began to wonder if the woman who had appeared in his headlights that snowy night was running from something far more serious than a wedding she didn't want. The truth began to unravel on a Tuesday evening when Marcus accidentally glimpsed Sarah through the window of his old studio, the room he'd sealed off after Anna's death because it held too many memories of dreams he'd abandoned. Sarah stood among the canvases covered in dust sheets, her hand reaching toward a portrait of Anna that Marcus had never been able to finish. The way she moved through the space, the way she tilted her head to examine the paintings, suggested she understood art in a way that went beyond casual appreciation. Marcus felt his heart racing as he watched her trace the air inches from the canvas, as if she was seeing brushstrokes and color choices that most people would never notice. When she turned toward the window, their eyes met through the glass, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression that looked like recognition mixed with guilt. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, fueled by Marcus's growing sense that Sarah had been studying him like a subject in one of her own paintings. He found her still in the studio, standing before the unfinished portrait of Anna with tears streaming down her face, and his carefully controlled emotions finally spilled over into words he'd been holding back for weeks. "She was beautiful," Sarah whispered, not turning around when she heard his footsteps. "You painted her soul, not just her face." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs, because those were the exact words a gallery owner had used to describe his work 15 years ago, before he'd given up everything to come home and take care of his dying father. "How do you know so much about art?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended, and Sarah finally turned to face him with eyes that held the weight of her own abandoned dreams. The partial truth that Sarah revealed that evening created more questions than it answered, but it explained the way she moved through the world with the careful grace of someone who had been trained to notice beauty in unexpected places. She was an artist, she admitted, who had run away from a life that felt like a prison disguised as privilege, but she couldn't bring herself to tell Marcus about the billions of dollars and the marriage contract that had driven her to that snowy roadside. Marcus felt betrayed by the deception, but also ashamed of his own reaction, because he recognized the look in Sarah's eyes as the same one he saw in his own mirror every morning. They were both people who had walked away from their art, but while Marcus had made that choice out of necessity, Sarah had made it out of desperation. The studio felt charged with the weight of their shared understanding, and Marcus found himself wanting to hate her for making him remember what he'd given up, and loving her for understanding why he'd had to give it up. The canvas handkerchief that Sarah left behind on his easel became a symbol of everything they couldn't say to each other. A small piece of fabric that held the imprint of sunflowers drawn in pencil by someone who understood that art wasn't about perfection, but about truth. Marcus held the handkerchief up to the light, studying the delicate lines that seemed to capture the essence of summer in a few simple strokes, and realized that Sarah's talent went far beyond anything he'd imagined. The sunflowers reminded him of a painting he'd done in college, his first successful piece that had convinced him he might have a future as an artist, and he wondered if Sarah had somehow seen that connection when she chose her subject. The handkerchief smelled faintly of her perfume, a scent that reminded him of expensive things he'd never been able to afford, and he found himself holding it like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. 3 weeks later, Cedar Falls was disrupted by the arrival of a black Mercedes sedan that looked as out of place as a diamond in a cornfield. James Morrison stepped out of the car, wearing a suit that cost more than most people in town made in a month. His silver hair perfectly styled and his eyes scanning Main Street with the cold efficiency of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. He walked into Miller's Diner like he owned it, his leather shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, and announced that he was looking for Sarah Wellington in a voice that carried the authority of unlimited money and unlimited power. The diner fell silent as every conversation stopped, and Sarah's face went white as she recognized the man who had been sent to bring her home to face the consequences of her choices. The revelation of Sarah's true identity hit Cedar Falls like a tornado, leaving everyone scrambling to make sense of the woman they thought they knew. Morrison's briefcase contained documents that painted a picture of wealth and privilege that seemed impossible to reconcile with the gentle woman who had been serving coffee and pie for 3 weeks. Sarah Wellington was the adopted daughter of Robert Wellington, a billionaire whose name appeared on buildings and foundations across the country, and she was contractually obligated to marry Richard Blackwood in a merger that would create one of the largest real estate empires in American history. The wedding she had run from wasn't just a personal ceremony, but a business transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and her disappearance had created legal and financial complications that threatened to destroy carefully laid plans. Morrison delivered his ultimatum with the smooth efficiency of someone who had never been told no, explaining that Sarah had 48 hours to return to New York or face the complete destruction of everything she had ever been given. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he tried to process the magnitude of Sarah's deception. The carefully constructed life she had built in Cedar Falls crumbling around them like a house of cards. The woman he had been falling in love with wasn't just Sarah, the runaway bride, but Sarah Wellington, heiress to a fortune that dwarfed the entire economy of their small town. He thought about the way she had touched his tools in the garage, the way she had encouraged Emma's drawings, the way she had looked at his paintings with tears in her eyes, and wondered if any of it had been real, or if she had just been playing a role in some elaborate game he didn't understand. The coffee shop felt suffocating as neighbors who had welcomed Sarah into their community began to whisper about deception and betrayal, and Marcus found himself caught between his growing feelings for a woman who might not exist and his responsibility to protect Emma from another devastating loss. The confrontation between Marcus and Sarah that evening took place in the garage, surrounded by the tools and machinery that represented everything honest and real in Marcus's life. Sarah tried to explain that her feelings for him and Emma were genuine, that the life she had built in Cedar Falls was the first authentic thing she had ever experienced. But Marcus couldn't get past the magnitude of her deception. "You can't run from who you are," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own compromises. "You're from a different world, Sarah. This was just you playing dress-up. in poverty. Sarah's face crumpled as she heard the pain in his voice, the way he made her wealth sound like a crime she had committed against him personally. "I chose this world," she whispered, reaching toward him with trembling hands. "I chose you, Emma, this life." But Marcus stepped back, his heart breaking as he protected himself from hoping for something that seemed impossible. "For how long?" he asked. "Until you get bored of playing poor?" Emma's tears that night were the hardest part of the whole devastating situation, because she couldn't understand why the woman who had made their family feel complete again had to disappear just when she was starting to feel safe. Marcus sat on the edge of his daughter's bed, trying to explain adult concepts like class differences and legal obligations to a child who only understood that someone she loved was going away. "Why can't Sarah just stay?" Emma asked, her voice thick with confusion and grief. "Why do rich people have to be different?" Marcus didn't have an answer that would make sense to an 8-year-old, so he just held her until she fell asleep, her small body shaking with sobs that reminded him of his own tears after Anna's funeral. The house felt empty again, the silence pressing down on them like a weight they would have to learn to carry all over again. Sarah's departure from Cedar Falls took place on a gray December morning that seemed to drain all the color from the world. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, leaving behind the uniform she had worn at the diner and the canvas handkerchief that had become too precious to take with her. Marcus watched from the garage as the black Mercedes pulled away, Sarah's face visible in the rear window for just a moment before she disappeared around the corner of Main Street. The handkerchief lay on his workbench like an accusation, the sunflowers still bright against the faded yellow fabric, and Marcus found himself wondering if he had made the right choice in letting her go. The snow began to fall again, covering her footprints in the driveway, erasing the last physical evidence that she had ever been there at all. 2 weeks after Sarah's departure, Marcus injured his right hand while working on a transmission, the wrench slipping and catching his knuckles against the engine block with enough force to require stitches. The emergency room at Cedar Falls General was quiet that afternoon, and Dr. Kim, the Korean-American physician who had moved to Iowa 5 years earlier, took his time examining the wound while they talked about art and the strange ways life forced people to give up their dreams. Dr. Kim had studied Marcus's paintings in graduate school, he revealed, back when Marcus Thompson was considered one of the most promising young artists in the Midwest. "Your wife came to see me about 6 months before she died," Dr. Kim said quietly, his hands gentle as he bandaged Marcus's injured fingers. "She was worried about you giving up your art, about what that sacrifice was doing to your soul. She asked me to tell you something if anything ever happened to her." The letter that Dr. Kim had kept in his desk drawer for 2 years felt like a message from beyond the grave, Anna's handwriting still familiar after all this time. "My dearest Marcus," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I need you to know that I never wanted you to give up your art for my sake. Love isn't about sacrifice. It's about wanting the other person to be their truest self. And your truest self has always been an artist. The canvas handkerchief you painted for me on our first date is still the most beautiful thing I've ever owned, and I want you to find someone who understands that beauty the way I do. Please don't let my death become another reason to stop creating. Please don't let fear keep you from becoming everything you were meant to be." Marcus read the letter 3 times before the words sank in, and when they did, he felt something crack open in his chest that had been frozen solid for 2 years. The canvas handkerchief that Sarah had left behind suddenly took on new meaning, as Marcus realized. It was the same piece of fabric he had painted for Anna 15 years ago, the sunflowers he had added to impress a girl he was falling in love with. Anna had kept it all these years, had it embroidered with delicate edges that turned his simple painting into something precious and lasting, and somehow it had found its way to another woman who understood the language of art and love and second chances. The sunflowers he had painted in his college dorm room had traveled through time to connect him with Sarah, and Marcus realized that Anna had been trying to tell him something about the nature of love and the importance of not giving up on the things that made life worth living. The handkerchief was a bridge between his past and his future, a piece of fabric that held the memories of one love and the promise of another. The news about Sarah's new life came to Marcus through the internet, Emma's teacher showing him an article about the Wellington Gallery's newest exhibition, featuring the work of an emerging artist who had captured the attention of the New York art scene. Sarah's paintings were displayed in photographs that showed scenes from small-town America, rendered with the kind of emotional honesty that could only come from someone who had lived in those moments rather than just observed them. Miller's diner appeared in one painting, bathed in the golden light of a winter morning, and Marcus recognized the exact angle Sarah must have seen from behind the counter when she served him coffee. The article mentioned that all proceeds from the exhibition would go to a new foundation supporting arts education in rural schools, and Marcus felt his heart break a little more as he realized that Sarah was using her wealth to give other people the opportunities she had never truly had. The decision to reopen his studio came to Marcus on a Sunday afternoon when Emma found him sitting in the dusty room, staring at the unfinished portrait of Anna with tears in his eyes. "Daddy," Emma said, her small hand slipping into his injured one, "why don't you paint anymore?" Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing Anna's eyes and his own stubborn chin, and realized that he had been modeling resignation instead of resilience, teaching Emma that dreams were things you gave up rather than things you fought for. "Maybe it's time I started again," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Maybe it's time we both started creating beautiful things again." Emma's face lit up with joy, and she immediately began planning the pictures she would draw while he painted, the studio filling with the sound of her excited chatter as she described all the colors she wanted to use. The first painting Marcus completed after reopening his studio was a portrait of Sarah working at the diner, her face concentrated as she poured coffee for a customer who remained just outside the frame. He painted her from memory, capturing the way the morning light had caught her hair, and the gentle curve of her smile when she thought no one was watching. The painting took him 3 weeks to complete, working in the evenings after Emma went to bed. And when it was finished, he knew it was the best work he had ever done. The portrait captured not just Sarah's physical appearance, but something deeper about her spirit. The way she had brought light into the dark spaces of his life without even trying. Marcus wrapped the painting carefully and addressed it to Sarah Wellington in care of the Wellington Gallery, along with a letter that took him 5 attempts to write correctly. The letter Marcus sent with the painting was simple and honest, free from the anger and hurt that had driven their last conversation. "Anna would have wanted you to have this," he wrote. "She believed that art was about truth, and this painting tells the truth about what you meant to us during your time here. Emma asks about you every day, and I tell her that sometimes people we love have to go away to become who they're meant to be. I hope you're becoming everything you were meant to be, Sarah. I hope you're painting sunflowers and teaching other people to see the beauty in simple things. The handkerchief you left behind is in Emma's room now, and she's learning to embroider new flowers around the edges. Thank you for reminding me that love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go with grace." Marcus mailed the package on a Tuesday morning, and then tried to put Sarah Wellington out of his mind once and for all. The spring that followed was the first season in 3 years that Marcus felt truly alive. His studio filled with new paintings, and Emma's laughter as she learned to mix colors and create shapes that resembled the world around them. He had started teaching art classes for children at the community center, using the techniques he remembered from his college days to help other kids discover their own creative voices. The garage continued to provide their main income, but Marcus found himself looking forward to the evenings when he could wash the grease from his hands and pick up a paintbrush instead of a wrench. Emma's drawings covered the refrigerator and the walls of the studio, her stick figures evolving into more complex representations of the family she was creating in her imagination. The canvas handkerchief had become her most treasured possession, and she carried it with her like a talisman of the love that had filled their house for 3 beautiful weeks. The yellow Honda Civic that pulled up to the garage on a Thursday afternoon in May looked familiar, but Marcus didn't allow himself to hope until he saw the woman who stepped out of the driver's seat. Sarah looked different than she had in December, her hair shorter and her clothes simpler, but her eyes held the same warmth that had drawn him to her in the first place. She carried a small suitcase and wore a canvas bag across her shoulder, and when she smiled at him through the garage window, Marcus felt his heart restart after months of barely beating. Emma saw her first, dropping her crayons and running across the garage floor with a squeal of pure joy, and Sarah caught her in a hug that lasted so long Marcus thought they might never let go of each other. "I came back," Sarah said simply, looking at Marcus over Emma's head. "I came home." The conversation that followed took place in the studio, surrounded by Marcus's new paintings and Emma's colorful drawings, while Emma sat on the floor with her crayons and listened to the adults talk about grown-up things like love and choice and the courage to build a life that made sense. Sarah explained that she had used her inheritance to buy her freedom from Robert Wellington, that she had paid back every penny he had spent on her education and her art training, and that she was no longer legally bound to marry Richard Blackwood or anyone else she didn't choose. The Wellington Gallery had offered her a permanent position as curator, but she had turned it down to return to Cedar Falls, where she planned to open a small art school for children who didn't have access to creative education. "I've spent my whole life being what other people needed me to be," Sarah said, her voice steady and sure. "I want to spend the rest of it being who I choose to be." Marcus felt the last of his walls crumble as he looked at the woman who had driven 800 miles to return to a life that offered her nothing but love and the freedom to be herself. Sarah had given up billions of dollars and a life of luxury to come back to a garage mechanic and his 8-year-old daughter, and Marcus realized that she had made the same choice he had made years ago when he came home to take care of his father. They were both people who had chosen love over money, family over career, and the courage to build something real over the safety of accepting what they were given. "Are you sure?" Marcus asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers interlacing with his paint-stained ones, and Marcus felt complete for the first time since Anna's death. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. The wedding that took place 6 months later was nothing like the elaborate ceremony Sarah had run from in New York, but it was everything she had never known she wanted. They were married in the community center, surrounded by the people of Cedar Falls, who had welcomed Sarah back with open arms and genuine affection. Emma served as the flower girl, scattering petals she had painted herself, and the canvas handkerchief was incorporated into Sarah's simple bouquet as something old, something that connected her to the love that had brought them all together. Marcus painted their wedding portrait himself, capturing the moment when Sarah lifted her face to his for their first kiss as husband and wife. And the painting became the centerpiece of their home. The sunflowers in the background were Emma's addition, painted in bright yellow crayon around the edges of the canvas, and they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The art school that Sarah opened in the renovated building next to the garage became a place where children from all over the county came to learn that beauty could be found in the simplest things, that creativity was not a luxury, but a necessity, and that everyone deserved the chance to express themselves through color and line and the movement of their hands across paper. Marcus taught the older students about realistic drawing and painting techniques, while Sarah focused on helping the younger children discover their own unique voices. Emma became their unofficial assistant, her natural enthusiasm for art making her the perfect bridge between the adult teachers and the student artists who looked up to her as someone who understood what it felt like to create something beautiful from nothing. The studio filled with laughter and the sound of children discovering their own talents, and Marcus and Sarah found themselves building not just a marriage, but a legacy that would outlast them both. The canvas handkerchief that had started their story continued to weave through their lives, carried by Emma to school and art classes and special occasions, its edges now embroidered with flowers from 3 generations of women who had understood that love was about creating beauty in the world. Anna's original sunflowers remained bright in the center, Sarah's pencil additions creating a garden around them, and Emma's careful stitches adding new blooms that represented the family they had all chosen to create together. The handkerchief became a symbol of continuity and hope, a reminder that love didn't end with death, but continued to grow and change and find new ways to express itself. On quiet evenings, Marcus would find Sarah and Emma sitting together in the studio, working on their embroidery while he painted, and he would feel Anna's presence in the room with them, blessing the life they had built from the fragments of their individual dreams. The years that followed were marked by the kind of happiness that comes from choosing love over fear, from deciding that the risk of loss is worth the possibility of joy. Marcus's paintings gained recognition throughout the Midwest, his work featured in galleries that appreciated his honest depiction of rural American life, but he never forgot that his greatest masterpiece was the family he had helped create. Sarah's art school expanded to include adult classes and summer workshops, bringing visiting artists to Cedar Falls and putting their small town on the map as a destination for people who wanted to learn about art and community, and the courage to start over. Emma grew into a confident young woman who carried herself with the assurance of someone who had been loved completely and taught to believe in her own worth. Her artwork evolving from crayon drawings to sophisticated paintings that captured the beauty of the world around her. The canvas handkerchief remained at the center of their family story, passed down from mother to daughter, each generation adding their own touches to the embroidered garden that surrounded Marcus's original sunflowers. When Emma graduated from high school and received a scholarship to study art at the State University, she carried the handkerchief with her as a reminder of home and the love that had shaped her into the person she had become. Sarah and Marcus stood together at the graduation ceremony, watching their daughter walk across the stage to receive her diploma, and Marcus felt the same sense of completion he had experienced on their wedding day. They had built something beautiful together, something that would continue to grow and change and inspire others long after they were gone. The final scene of their story takes place on a summer evening when the sunflowers in the field behind their house are in full bloom, their golden faces turned toward the setting sun like a congregation of worshipers acknowledging the source of all light. Marcus and Sarah sit on the porch swing he built for her as a wedding gift, watching Emma teach art to a group of neighborhood children in the yard, their laughter mixing with the sound of evening birds and the distant whistle of the train that still passes through Cedar Falls twice a day. The canvas handkerchief rests in Sarah's lap, its embroidered flowers catching the last rays of sunlight, and Marcus thinks about the night he found a woman in a torn wedding dress standing by the side of the road. He realizes now that rescue is never a one-way transaction, that Sarah saved him just as much as he saved her, and that love is always about two people choosing each other every day, again and again, until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing. The story ends not with words, but with the sound of children's laughter and the sight of sunflowers blooming in the field where Anna once walked, where Sarah learnt to call a small Iowa town home, and where Emma discovered that family is not something you're born into, but something you create through love and patience and the courage to keep your heart open even when it's been broken. The canvas handkerchief that started it all continues to pass from hand to hand, carrying with it the story of three women who understood that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the depth of connection between hearts that choose to beat in harmony. And in Cedar Falls, where everyone knows everyone's business, the people still talk about the runaway bride who came home to love, and the single father who learned that second chances are worth the risk of hoping for something beautiful.